Hi, I'm Joseph Feraldi. I want to thank you for joining us here at Bayside Chapel online. Our prayer is that today's service will be a blessing to you, that it will encourage you in your journey with Jesus Christ, and it will help you to see all that God has in store for you. We would love to hear from you on how God is using this ministry to bless you, and we'd love the opportunity to pray for you. Just send us an email at amen@baysidechapel.org. Remember that you can stay in touch with us at any time. Just visit the App Store and search for our app at Bayside Chapel of NJ. Also, if God is using this ministry to bless you, we'd like to give you the opportunity to partner with us financially. Simply go online to baysidechapel.org or use the Bayside Chapel app and choose whatever option works best for you. Enjoy today's message.
But here we are, and we just came off of Easter season, and I'm always amazed, when Easter season happens, and we kind of get to go through the whole story. We kind of make it a priority to really look at Jesus' life in full. I know for me, I kind of have this habit of a couple weeks before Easter, I'd like to watch Jesus of Nazareth. That was my favorite. It was done like in the late 70s, I believe, and because life has kind of slowed down this year, I got to actually get my kids involved a little bit, and yeah, they kind of made fun that it was like really kind of old looking to them. Well, we got a chance to watch it, and some of them missed the middle parts and stuff, but really we got a chance to watch the ending, and I'm always amazed, no matter how many times I watch that or just allow myself to go through the life and ministry of Jesus and the cross and the whole story together. I'm always amazed at the power that story still has on me. It affects me. And I know it affects a lot of people too. And I started to really kind of process this, like, what is it? I mean, I don't want to just boil the gospel down to just a story, but really it's just a story. And so it can't just be the storyteller, right? Because the movie I like to watch is kind of low budget compared to today's movie. So it can't just be the storyteller, right? That is making this story so great. There's got to be something else there. There has to be something else besides just a story, even though it really is just a story. And so I started to think, like, what are some of the things? It can't be just a storyteller, because the storyteller, we've all heard bad stories, right? We all know people who tell stories really, really bad. I mean, sometimes somebody could tell you a story, it seems to be going nowhere. It seems to rabbit trail into places you don't even know what they're talking about, and you find yourself thinking about taking out the garbage when you get home or doing the laundry, because no matter what, you can't get away from this story quick enough. It's told that bad. There's bad storytellers. And then there's pot stirrer storytellers. You know these people? There's people that tell stories just to kind of stir the pot. If you're into social media, you might see a lot of that on social media, where people post things like, hate my job, and then they don't say anything. They're just waiting for somebody to come along and go, why do you hate your job? And then they want to stir the pot, and you kind of watch their reaction. So there's all these ways to tell bad stories. There's also ways to tell great stories as well. There's stories that move us. There's stories that when they're told well, that they bring you into the scenery. They bring you into the time. They bring you into the space. You could almost smell it. You could feel it. You could feel where they were going. And they're amazing stories. And they kind of draw you in, and they pull up your emotions. Sometimes they're sad emotions. Sometimes they're happy emotions. Sometimes they even get you to think or even change your ways about something, because they're so told so well. But is that really what we're talking about here with the story of Jesus? I don't think so. I think there's more to it. So if you will, today, I want you to kind of walk through this with me, because I want to know what else is behind this story, because it's so important, and it affects so many lives and in so many different ways. And I want to ask this question: would it benefit your life to know the power behind the world's most powerful story? I mean, it is just a story, but there's something about it. It doesn't matter who's telling it. It doesn't matter what language it's in. It doesn't matter what time of year it's told, whether it's told in the summer or around Easter. It doesn't matter who it's told to. And when it's told, it causes things to happen that when you and I tell a story, don't usually happen. It's a story about a man from a couple of thousand years ago that had a working ministry for only 3 years. And yet that story still has so much impact today. 3 years of ministry over 2,000 years ago, and we're still telling this story, and it's still affecting people. I would challenge you to find anybody who is a professor, anybody who's doing great things, and pick out their 3 best years, and ask yourself, will we look at that snapshot and 2,000 plus years later still be telling their story and it affecting people? Most likely not. Of course, today's story is not just a story, it's a story about Jesus. And we're going to be jumping into a new series today where we're going to be taking a look at the book of 1 Thessalonians, which was written by the Apostle Paul. And we're going to be looking at the idea of ready, being ready. Are you ready? As if, are you ready and even anticipating the return of Jesus? But in order to be ready for the return of Jesus, I think we need to fully understand the power of the story of Jesus that our writer, the Apostle Paul, is spreading. Paul is on one of his many missionary journeys, and he's telling this story, this same story that has been told till today and will still continue to be told. The same story we just finished up last weekend. So Paul, whose ministry journeys fill a lot of the New Testament, he traveled great distances telling this story of good news of Jesus to most of the Roman Empire. His combined trips by land and sea, if we were to measure that today, would calculate to be 13,000 air miles. To travel that much just to tell a story, that better be a pretty compelling story. And so Paul and his co-workers, his friends, are the ones that tell this powerful story everywhere. So before we get into 1 Thessalonians, we're going to take a step back into the book of Acts, where the journey begins, where Paul first met the Thessalonian people. And the book of Acts is written by Luke, the writer of the Gospel of Luke, and is also named the Acts of the Apostles. Because in the beginning of the book, it tells about the spreading of the early church, but the second half of the book of Acts primarily follows the journeys of the Apostle Paul, and as he takes his story of the good news to both Jews and Gentiles. So what happens when Paul, our storyteller today, first takes his story to the Thessalonian people? Now, before we do that, I want you to put yourself into Paul's shoes, because he knows how powerful this story is. Because it's from his own life experiences. And like some of the examples I gave earlier, some of the best stories come from your own personal experience. Or if you listen to somebody else tell their own personal experience, those are the stories that really have an effect on people. And if we put ourselves in Paul's shoes, this story affected him. Let's not forget that if you know the story of the Apostle Paul, he was on the opposite side of this story at first. He persecuted people who believed in this story until it affected him. And now here he is traveling all over the known world at that point, telling this same story that we tell today. So if you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to Acts chapter 17. If you have the app, you can just click on Bible. It'll take you to Acts chapter 17. And we're going to start right in verse 1 as we kind of look at this snapshot picture of Paul as he first enters the town and starts to tell his story. Verse 1, Acts 17, verse 1 says, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews." All right, so let me set this up a little bit. Paul is traveling with his friends. Mainly in this one, he's traveling with Silas. And just so you know, right before this, Paul and Silas were in jail. They were beaten, they were bruised, they were on concrete floors, chained to the ground, and there's a whole great story there in Acts 16 to read, right before they come to the point where we just read. And the journey they just took from where they were jailed in Philippi to where they are right now is 100 miles. Now, they didn't have cars. So imagine that 100-mile journey. That 100-mile journey, they were sore. They were beaten down from the experience they had. And as we're kind of looking for what is some of the power behind this story, I'm going to drop a couple little clues in, because I think as we kind of tell this story of Paul, I want to look at some examples of maybe that this is where some of this power comes from. We'll kind of journey through this together. And this is, if we want to look, here's the first one right here. Paul and Silas were beaten, they were sore, they came over 100 miles to tell this story again. Everywhere they go, this is happening. And here they are again telling this story. So our clue number one could be this, that this story has the power to overcome suffering. I mean, Paul and Silas were suffering. Everywhere they went to tell this story, there was suffering attached to it, but they continue to overcome that suffering and continue to travel and tell this story. It reminds me of some of our missionaries. I think of the Ellis family out in Vanuatu, all the way on the other side of the world, and the suffering that they go through just to continue to tell that same story of Christ in a different language as they deal with hurricanes and bad weather and poor living conditions. They have smiles on their faces, and they are persevering as they continue to tell the story, because they know how powerful it is, and they know how it has to get out to every language group. And so here we see, just like Paul, yes, he's been going through some hard times, but he continues to push through to tell this story. So that's verse 1. Let's look at verse 2 and 3. It says, "And Paul went in, and was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, 'This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ.'" If you were to look backwards a little bit in Acts, you would see that this is actually normal practice for Paul. He would head out into a new area, and he would find where the Jews are first. And like I told you, Luke is the writer of Acts, and Luke wrote these same words down when he was watching Jesus do this. In Luke 4, Jesus not only went to the synagogue first, but he went there to teach as well. And that's what our scripture says, that Paul went into the synagogues to teach. When Jesus did it in Luke 4, he was teaching and proving the word from the prophet Isaiah. And it says that Paul is explaining and proving. So I just kind of put those two words together, and that means to make clear and understandable and known in detail, all while establishing truth, authenticity, and validity. And that's what Paul is doing. And where's he doing it from? The Old Testament scriptures. It seems that Paul would be preaching in the same way as our previous series, Verified, is. If you had joined us these last bunch of weeks, we were preaching through a series called Verified, where we were reasoning and proving and explaining from the Old Testament the signs of Jesus. Why were Paul not preaching from the New Testament? There was no New Testament yet. And just like our previous series, it would have been really hard for his listeners, the Jews in the synagogue, or whoever was listening, to argue with the Old Testament scriptures. It was their book. It was what they went by. And that's what Paul was using. And Jesus had fulfilled what the scriptures had said. Therefore, he was the Messiah. That was the essence of Paul's teaching, just like the series we just came out of. And so our story kind of continues. We have Paul and Silas, and they travel into Thessalonica, and they had a hard journey. They shouldn't have made it there, but they made it there. They were bruised, they were beaten, and they go right to it. Paul goes right to the synagogue, and in 3 Sabbath days, he's out there proving and explaining this story. Let's pick it up in verse 4. "And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women." So Luke is pointing out for us that it's notable that some Jews believed Paul's story, a lot of devout Greeks, and some women. Now, the reason he mentions women, because women were most likely in high standing because of who they were married to. He singled out female converts, and this is the Macedonia region, because in that time and place, women had considerable social and civic influence. And Thessalonica was the capital of Macedonia. And the gospel of the good news was received by men and women from different backgrounds and different places and different nationalities. These are the people that Luke tells us were accepting this story that we're concentrating on today. He uses the phrase not a few, and that just lets us know that it wasn't a few. This was a large crowd. And so again, as I mentioned before, as we're going to drop some hints on maybe these are some of the reasons of the power behind this story, we have to say that this story has the power to persuade all kinds of people. And so here we are. Paul's in the synagogue. He's preaching. There's people listening. There's people who not necessarily should be turning their ways to this, believing this story, as Paul's telling it. It must be pretty powerful. And here they are believing. Some Jews, some Gentiles, and women, and they're believing. So let's pick it up in verse 5. It says, "But the Jews were jealous. And taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd." Now, Jason isn't mentioned anywhere else. Jason is just the person who was most likely housing Paul and Silas and whoever else was with them. So here we are. It says the Jews were jealous. So I asked the question, jealous about what? Paul was merely had their book, the Old Testament, and he's telling this story of Jesus. And it says the Jews were jealous. What were they jealous of? Perhaps this story was taking some attention away from them. Maybe it was taking bodies out of their church. Maybe it was taking monies out of their synagogue. Maybe it was taking people away from the synagogue. The town they were in is not predominantly a Jewish town, so maybe they'd lose their status a little bit if too many people left. Luke describes the men they took with him as rabbles, and rabbles are merely just men at the marketplace who hung around and had nothing else to do. And there are multiple reasons we can see throughout Scripture that resulted in persecution, but jealousy isn't usually one of them. So what do they do? What do they do when they're jealous or unhappy with the choice of somebody else's belief or somebody else's religion? Well, the Jews followed a standard operating procedure for them at that time of day. They found some riffraff, they formed a mob, and they started a riot. Sound familiar? That's exactly what happened when Jesus was rejected. And now Paul's good news of Jesus is being rejected with the same outcome. It says they set the city in an uproar with their mob. I want you to remember those words, set the city in an uproar, because we're going to come back to them in a minute. But do you see what can seem like a lot? It seems like a lot when they say they set the whole city in an uproar with their mob. Again, if we're going to drop another clue here, we can say that this story has the power to cause people to protest. Because if it didn't have any power, they wouldn't protest. So let's continue. We have Paul. We have him preaching. We have people being converted. Now we have the Jewish people of that day jealous and upset, and they gather some people, some rabble, some people with nothing else to do, and they form a mob, and they start to drum up all this attention. Remember the pot stirrers I talked about earlier? The pot stirring type people. They're drawing them up, and they're causing the whole city to go in an uproar. Let's pick it up in verse 6. Verse 6 says, "And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, 'These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also.' And Jason received them. And they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." Remember those words from verse 5 that I told you remember, where they said the mob had turned the city in an uproar? I want you to notice how they describe the gospel, this news that Paul is telling. Their mob may have turned the city in an uproar, but they describe the gospel as turning the world upside down. Their charge of king, them saying that there's another king besides Caesar, is the same exact charge that was leveled at Jesus. I mean, you can just picture it. Jesus standing before Pilate and the chief priests, as depicted in John 19, and they were crying out, and Pilate said, "Here is your king." And their answer was, "We have no other king but Caesar." How convenient. And here they are again saying, here's Paul saying that there's another king, but we only have Caesar as a king. You know what? They were right when they described him as another king, because the Greek word translated another actually means another of a different kind. That is, a king unlike Caesar. You see, the kingship of Jesus is unlike that of any of the rulers of this world. They just didn't understand it. They didn't see it because Jesus doesn't conquer with an army. He doesn't conquer with conventional weapons. He doesn't conquer things with hatred. He doesn't conquer things with falsehood, with lies and deception. Jesus conquered through his cross, where he died for a world of lost sinners. And he even died for his enemies, just like the people who are his enemies right at that point, right in this point in time in this story. He died for them as well. It's a king like they could never comprehend. So yeah, it is a different kind of king. And so as our story starts to come to a close, you can see here they are dragging Jason out of his house and anyone who had anything to do with them, and they're bringing them before the courts, and they're saying, these men were housing the men that are turning the world upside down with this story. Remind me, this one story, turning the world upside down. Let's see how this ends in verse 8. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Well, isn't that nice? Little money under the table. Jason, be a good boy. They couldn't find Paul and Silas at this point, so they must have been warned and they must have left. Basically, they posted a security bond assuring that no more Paul and Silas in Thessalonica. And because they were forced to leave so early, Paul sent another companion of his, Timothy, back to Thessalonica a couple months later to do a checkup on them. Because remember, a whole bunch of people have converted. Jews, Greeks, women, a whole bunch of people had converted. And because Paul had to leave early, he sent Timothy back to go check up on them. And Timothy came back to Paul with a report, which caused Paul to write the book, 1 Thessalonians, which we'll begin to jump into next week. Here's where I want to camp out for just a little bit with the rest of our time. I want to camp out in verse 6 because this is the part of the story that always intrigues me. This part of turning the world upside down from just a single story. What does it look like, and how could it turn the whole world upside down from a story about just one person? Can one person really do something that turns the whole world upside down? Hello? COVID-19. One guy halfway across the world eats a medium rare bat, and here we are. One guy. So yeah, one story can. Or maybe it's because society sees world one way, but Jesus, in his ministry, when Jesus spoke of this world, he spoke in a different way. I had it explained to me once, many years ago, what it kind of looks like for when Jesus spoke about the people of this world. And he talked about it in pyramid form, right? And you know, I figured the kids are off of school. My middle son, Anthony, he texted me the other day, hashtag bored. I texted him back, hashtag make daddy a preaching prop, so he made me this. Pyramid. And so, this is the way we see the world. We have at the top of the pyramid, we have the rich, and we have the powerful. Nothing wrong with money, nothing wrong with being powerful, but this is the way we see society. The famous, the rich, the powerful, the sports legends, everything which, by the way, we don't actually have right now, right? Here's all the real important stuff. Then a lot of us sit towards the middle. And then there's the people on the bottom of this pyramid, the people who are poor, the people who are hungry, the people who are merciful, right? Starting to sound familiar? And here's what Jesus did. Here's what Jesus taught. This is what it looks like for the world to be turned upside down. That's the way Jesus taught. And if you need any proof, you could look at Matthew 5:2, right in the beginning, a very, very famous section of the Gospel of Matthew, the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Where are they now? Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are meek. Blessed are those who are hunger. Blessed are those who are merciful. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the persecuted. I don't see in that speech any athletes. Nothing wrong with being an athlete. The rich, the powerful, the famous, the influencers. That seems to be real popular today. I don't see them anywhere in Jesus' upside down world, upside down way of thinking. And that's why this gospel, this good news of Jesus, is described as turning the world upside down. But be warned, especially today, be warned. There are a lot of gospels out there that don't have this world upside down type of power. There's a lot of false gospels out there that may be luring you in. Some of them sound like this. There's ones that always make you feel warm and cozy because the way you're living is just fine. You know, you do you. That's a good one. Or just keep doing, here's another one. Just keep doing what you're doing and try and be a better person to yourself and others. God loves that. I read that somewhere in the Bible, you know, do unto others, something like that. That's one of those gospels that's out there. Or there's all roads lead back to God. Just pick a road and begin your journey. My favorite one is the one we seem to gravitate to now that, you know, America's in this crisis mode. I call it the America gospel. We have our flags. We say, in God we trust. We love our country, and in God we trust. Okay, great. I'm with you. I also love this country, the greatest place in the world to live, the land of freedom. I love this country, our flag. I love it all. But the problem with that gospel is this same gospel is not only for America. It's for everybody, all over the world. And I'm not mocking if these are some of the ways where you started to think about faith or spirituality. I'm just pointing out that this isn't the real gospel, because if the gospel doesn't turn your world upside down, you've got the wrong gospel. So what's the power behind our story? We've seen some of the clues along the way. Why did this story cause such a stir? I mean, can they really accuse Paul of telling a story about a man that's turning the world upside down? Maybe it's because the real power of the gospel is because of the gospel's main subject, Jesus Christ. Every bit of power from this story comes from the main character of the story, the Son of the living God, God himself in the flesh, Jesus Christ. He's everything in this story. Take Jesus out of this story, and you know what it is? It's just a plain old story. I heard a pastor once many years ago explain it this way. I want you to think of a football game. In the game of football, there really is no game without the football. You could have your players get ready, and you could have them put on shoulder pads, and you could have them put on cleats, and you could have them put on their helmets, and you could have them get all geared up and get out on that field. But without the ball, there's no football. And every time they take the ball and they drive downfield, or they try and cross the goal line, or they kick it through the uprights, no matter what they do, none of it matters without the ball. And that kind of is an example of our story here. It's a nice story. It's a good story. It's a story of this amazing journey. But without Jesus Christ as the center of this story, it's just a story. So you can go to church. Maybe right now you're considering some of those other gospels, the feel good, the any road leads to God gospel, whatever. You can do all that. You could even come to church. You could be a good person. You could help others. And it's good, and it may last a little while, but life without the main character of our story is just a story. With Jesus as our character in the story, we need to think about what Jesus said in this story. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The gospel gives life. And I'm here to remind you today, or maybe you're even hearing it for the first time, but life looks different through the life-giving gospel. It does. It looks different. The gospel turns our world upside down, like I said before. If not, it's not the right gospel. And the gospel should turn your life around, not for the sake of just throwing your life into a tizzy, but to show you a way to deal with things. All this self-help, all this self-trying to fix, self-medicate. All the things we can't deal with on our own, the gospel addresses, mainly our sin. Yeah, our sin. I have a group on Monday nights called Starting Point. There's about 40 of us now that meet online through a Zoom meeting, and we went through the chapter talking about sin. So I have to give a shout out to my Starting Point group, because when I started talking about sin in this chapter, you could just feel the sense in the room that it just got like, ooh, sin. So I brought up the definition. Sin, as it's used in the Bible, is merely just missing the mark. We've all missed the mark. You've missed the mark. I've missed the mark. That's sin. We can't deal with that on our own. Inside the gospel is the answer to that. Let me also remind you that the gospel is not a one-time thing. This story that we're talking about is not just a one-time thing. I need to be reminded daily of the gospel, because it continues to throw my thoughts, my thinking, my attitude towards others, my love for others upside down of how I would normally think. It makes me think more like how Jesus would think. But there's another aspect of the gospel that also turns our world upside down that we could never, ever overlook or forget. And that's grace. In the good news of Jesus Christ, in this story, you will find the ultimate fulfillment of both grace and truth. The Apostle John was a good friend of Jesus's, and he traveled with Jesus. He was Jesus's favorite. And in John's gospel, right in the beginning in chapter 1, verse 16, he says this. He describes it this way. For from his fullness we have received grace upon grace. The law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So while the gospel will make you confront the way you're doing things and living out your life, that's the truth part of it. It's also full of never-ending grace, a grace that we could never fully understand because we're not that good at experiencing it or even giving it out ever. Have you ever noticed that sometimes we beat ourselves up because we think we've gone too far and there's not actually enough grace for us, which is a total lie. But then on the other side of the coin, we're pretty stingy at extending grace as well. And so because of that, we don't understand the grace that's in the gospel. We don't see it that way. And that's just one of the many reasons that the gospel story is so incredibly powerful and life-giving. The reason the good news of Jesus Christ is so powerful is that it touches everyone right where they need it. It's the one story that will be told forever, and it covers it all. If somebody were to ask me, what do I do with this in my life? I would say, I got a story for you. To those searching for acceptance in all the wrong places, I got a story for you. To those searching for fulfilling relationships, I got a story for you. To those who struggle with being tolerant towards others, I got a story for you that you need to hear. For those who fear disapproval, I got a story for you. To anyone longing for a new start and you just can't figure out where to begin, I've got a story for you. But be warned, because when I tell you this story, it's going to turn your world upside down. And it should. Because like I said earlier, life is going to look different through the life-giving gospel. It changes our way of thinking. And it feels odd at first. It does. But that's good. That's called change. And this story will never, ever get old. It's been being told for over 2,000 years, and it will continue on and on and on until the good Lord comes back. And it will never lose an ounce of its power since the days of Paul telling it in the story we just read, and 2,000 years from now if we're still here. And so I want you to remember that there's power in this story. That it's not just a story. There's power in it. That power comes from the main character, Jesus Christ. So next week when we jump into our series Ready and we jump into the book of 1 Thessalonians and we ask ourselves, are we ready? Are we in fact living a life ready in anticipation of Jesus? I want you to remember the power of the story of Jesus as we dive into that. I'm going to ask the band guys to come back up. as I issue several different groups of people a challenge before we leave together with our time. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, I want you to hear me. So maybe the question for you and me today isn't so much ready, are we ready, but also, are those around you ready? Are you living your life in such a way that this powerful story of the gospel is being lived out in front of others? Do your friends notice? Does your family notice? Do your kids notice? Does your life look like it's been flipped upside down from the way you used to live, and people are saying, what is it about him or what is it about her that they act so much differently? I need to know what that is. Are you living that kind of life out? If you know the power of the story of the gospel, it should be. It should be for you. It should be for me. And so I challenge you to take a look at your life, especially during these times. People are watching. They want to see how you're responding to it. Your kids are watching. Your family's watching. Your friends are watching. So as a believer, I challenge you to take a look at your life. Ask God, am I doing everything I can to show the love and the power of this story of your Son, Jesus Christ? And if you're here listening today and maybe this is the first time you're hearing this story, or you're scared about all the stuff that's going on, and you're just kind of exploring, you're thinking there's something else out there, and you heard about church, man, are we happy you joined us today. And I don't want you to be thrown by that feeling of I'm looking into this, but it doesn't feel right. It feels like the world's upside down. It feels like this when I hear this story about Jesus. It doesn't feel right. Look, I can't even hold it. It doesn't feel right. You know what I want you to do? I want you to press into that feeling this morning, because I guarantee you it's right. Don't shy away from it. The story of God is amazing. The story of Christ on this earth is amazing, and it's going to look different. Life's going to look different when you filter it through the gospel. So press into it this morning. I'm going to give you an opportunity now as I pray to make a decision to finally learn to live your life through that gospel. Father, I want to thank you for this time this morning. And Lord, I want to speak specifically to somebody who's watching right now, Lord. Somebody is sitting there right now who feels like, I can't do that. I can't follow this kind of teaching. This is not my world. It would throw my whole world upside down. Father, I want you to open their hearts right now to know that that's a good thing. That's the thing they need. That's the thing they've been searching for. That's the thing they've been yearning for. Their heart aches for it. Lord, help them to press into it. If that's you this morning, it's very simple. You say, God, I can't do this on my own. God, here I am. I'm a sinner with problems, and I don't know how to get out of it, and I'm scared. And just open up your heart to him and say, Lord, I believe you died on that cross for me. I don't understand it all. I may not even believe it all yet, but I believe that you're the answer. I believe that you sent your Son to die in my place. So Lord, now enter my heart. I can't do this alone anymore. I can't. Father, enter my life. Make me anew. Forgive me of my sins and show me a new way. If that was the prayer of your heart this morning, we are so happy. You could right now, there's a little thing that pops up that says, I raise my hand for Christ today. Would you do me a favor and go ahead and click that? Because we want to get a book in your hand. We have a little booklet that we can get in your hand that says, I said yes. And it has a lot of the beginning steps, a lot of the stuff in the story that we talked about that has such power today. There's a lot of that in that book to help get you started, and we'd love to help you on that journey. The other reason we want you to click that button is because today is a new day for you. Today is day one of a new start, a day one of your life being turned upside down for the good. And we want to celebrate with you. Because when you click that button, our hearts melt because we know that you are now entering the kingdom of God. And we couldn't be any more excited. We love you. We thank all of you for joining us today here at Bayside Chapel Online.